Hello, everyone, and welcome to another irregular taping or recording of Conversations from the Edge. We're with John White again. And John, as you know, is one of he's the guy we say, this is the philosophy teacher we wish we had, because he is really very, very popular with us at the Institute. His classes are spectacular. And the reason we're recording this is the reason we record a lot of these things. It's really very simple. I was at the movies with my son, and he really enjoys movies and all things media. And he was very excited because next year there's going to be a new movie coming out on the Odyssey. And I remembered in 1997 there was a made-for-television miniseries of 2 episodes of the Odyssey. And I thought, well, I'll refresh myself because that particular miniseries not only has a spectacular cast, uh, and of course we have Isabella Rossellini playing Athena. We have Vanessa Williams and Bernadette Peters playing, what is it, Calypso and Circes, and a bunch of other guys. Who cares really who they are? Did I mention that Isabella Rossellini was in it? Stunning, right? I mean, she's appearing to you in your dreams, and it's okay. It's a goddess. So someone's clearly blessed. But the show itself received very good reviews as being, of course, it can't be comprehensive, but it hit all the key points in the story very accurately. So if we wanted a media cliff note version, this is what we wish we could have watched when we were being forced to read this in college.
That's right.
Because I did. I read it in college. I read it in a week. We're told, boom, 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 boom.
Right.
Get nothing out of it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
and I jokingly said to you, look, I've read what is it, Beowulf 4 times. I couldn't
Yeah.
tell you anything about it. So I thought that given that this is really an interesting key text in not only the Western canon, but also part of the initiatic traditions and ties into things that you've talked about, John, in other cases, that is the Italic tradition, the role of the hero. Instead of us just talking about it on the phone and it going into the aether, never to be returned again, we're going to record it and share it with others. So that's why we're here.
All right. Very good.
So, when I saw the movie, again, the miniseries, I was thinking to myself that we see Odysseus and he is on his island. He's the king. Everybody loves him, so we're told. Uh, but war comes to him. He can't avoid the outside world. The outside world comes to him and forces him away from the woman he loves, from his newborn child, to go fight in the Trojan War. Now, the Trojan War, for those who don't know, is a critical part of the founding myth of Rome. And that's how that ties in later to the Italic mythos. But it's fascinating to me because he's taken from the woman he loves to fight for 10 years and then journey for another 10, so 20 years, basically over a war because somebody kidnapped someone else's queen. So
That's right. Exactly.
and I have a rough time seeing many of these guys as I see them as heroic, meaning courageous, but I don't see them as very noble in any way, many of these
Yeah.
characters. So maybe you could help walk me through this, because even at the end of it, I got some key ideas to walk away with that we'll talk about. But like so many other people, I don't really understand the story. And I'm okay admitting that. I'm okay.
Well, I can't claim that I do either. It's been a long time since I actually read it. But one of the things that I do think is important in that is to understand that the Greek islands and the peninsula of Greece, that at least as the story is told, that there were a number of oaths that were sworn. I mean, that was how they made themselves into a community, that these various princes would work together. And that's in the background of this. So that has an esoteric component, doesn't it? It has to do with the idea that you make these oaths of honor, and that you have to fulfill them if anything like this happens. Nobody foresaw it happening, of course, and especially in this way, that Menelaus' wife would be taken, and then that the chaos that was thrown, because as you remember from the Iliad, that Paris throws the apple and says to the most beautiful, and so all of the goddesses are fighting with each other, as well as the fight over Helen. So it's it's interesting that it poses a kind of chaos, of course, that actually produces the war. But it's also interesting that it's a chaos produced over beauty. Now, if you think about that for a moment, the beautiful is, of course, the highest in Plato, for example, in the Symposium. And beauty exists in the world primarily so that we transcend the beauty of the physical world and come to understand what's the highest beauty, which is, of course, the divine and participating in the divine in the one. So it's interesting that somewhere in here, it seems to me, is an implicit um, kind of initiatic factor as well. That is that how you approach the beautiful, understood as not simply the physical beauty, but taking the physical beauty and transforming it into an analogy so that you can begin to understand higher forms of beauty. That's what you're supposed to do. On the other hand, throw a little chaos in that direction and it's not going to happen. So it also shows how fragile that sort of movement of the psyche, which Plato emphasized, is.
Well, that brings to mind a statement that was made to me by a good friend of ours many years ago, in which he said to me, I don't wish to make the world better.
Mm.
I wish to make it more beautiful.
Mm.
And at the time, I understood what he said, but over time, I understood it more contextually, being that he was an expert in the classics and classical initiation. So and I've said it often myself in different interviews to try and help reorient our notion away from this idea of virtue always having to deal with exterior action.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, because beauty is I mean, one of the things that's most important here, I would say, is that beauty is basically what correlates to love. You only love something insofar as you're experiencing it as beautiful. So when you undermine the beautiful, you also undermine what's at least arguably, but I would consider the highest act that humans can do. And that's not like sentimental love. By love, I really mean the deep affirmation of what is worthy of being loved.
That would tie into two things we've talked about at length. One is Culiano's Eros and magic in the
Oh, yeah.
Renaissance,
Yep.
and also the great question of the last, really the last 20 or 30 years, but when we get right down to it, really the last 10, 5 or
Mm,
10, is
mm,
the, we wouldn't even say the degrading nature, but the uglification.
mhm.
I mean, the truly making things ugly,
Yes.
uh, out of proportion, out of context, out of
Yeah.
harmony, out of symmetry, uh,
Yes.
as a expression and intentional, and then
Yeah.
dropping it in the public space, in the public psyche.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. There's a strong impulse in that direction, it seems to me, that it's because as soon as you talk about beautiful, then of course people get worked up. Well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, there's always an attempt to relativize beauty. For some reason, the idea that there might be standards of beauty or something that falls outside that standards feels like you have no right to say that or even think it or feel it or anything of that kind. The ancients, of course, didn't see it that way. I mean, things like you're saying, harmony, the way things fit together. Even in the Middle Ages, you find notions of ethics that are actually primarily based on beauty, because Duns Scotus, who was maybe not a household name, but nonetheless was one of the giants of the medieval philosophy and theology. His whole understanding of ethics was based on the idea that the act has to be beautiful, and what he means is that it's harmonious and concordant with the worth of the object and how it is that one is relating to it. And so again, the beauty and love are somehow connected in there. He actually understands the act of the will in ethics to be love based, and that what it's forming is something that's beautiful. Beauty was understood as a transcendental in the medieval philosophy, which means that all things have pulchrum, beauty, but our task is to actually release that beauty. You can hear almost a Kabbalistic overtone here, right? That, the shards that are in all things, that they also have an element of pulchrum, of beauty in them. And so that would actually be our work. So when you live in a society it's essentially reduced all value to consumption, right? So it's really a matter
Mhm.
that you commodify everything. So if something is good because I call it good, that there's no intrinsic kind of goodness, that may give you the fantasy that you're somehow free because you don't have to conform to anything. But unfortunately, our nature isn't really designed that way. Our nature is designed to relate to actual beauty, actual good, and so forth. And we can dispute, whether something counts as good or beautiful or true. But the point is that if we can dispute about it, it's because it exists. So let's try to understand it rather than say, no, it just doesn't exist. It's all just a matter of what I want, what I consume.
Well, that just reminds me as we pass on our next point is that many years ago, maybe 10, 15, there was a study, and I'm sure there have been others since then, on an international level, and they showed that on the internationally, the understanding of what is physically attractive is for the most part the same.
Ah, interesting.
I mean, there were exceptions, of course,
Mm.
but in general, and it
Hmm.
was something in the 80 plus percentile, there
Oh,
was this general understanding of what
mm.
constituted beauty.
Yeah.
I was thinking the other part that we see happening in this is that Odysseus is really, Ithaca is the smallest island. He's kind
Hmm.
of this big fish in this very small pond, and he gets yanked out of it, and he gets
Yeah.
sent on this journey. And we've looked at parts of this journey um, in terms of Athena appears to him. And I believe she says to him, at least it says several times, that men are nothing without the gods.
Mm.
And that what the gods seem to like the most about him, at least in the way it was described, and you said it was different, but was his intelligence, that he
Mm.
thought
Mhm.
about things instead of just
Yeah.
rushing in and
Yes.
making a bad situation worse. He could solve problems.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
that discriminatory nature is considered. It's interesting because we don't spend a lot of time with that in modern esotericism, yet
Mhm.
it's a critical part of the Indian yogas. It's critical because without refining the mind,
Yeah.
one does not have discriminatory capacity. One does not understand the consequences of their actions,
Yeah.
and therefore they do not understand karma, and things just go from bad to worse.
Yes, exactly. What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Don't ask. We'll find out.
Yeah.
So, looking at those points, and of course, Athena appears to him because of his faith in her. And you could
Yeah.
just go off on those and see
Yeah.
where they take you.
Yeah, those are really important points, and it bears meditation, well beyond anything that I would say on this. But there are a couple things I would say. Is that one is that Athena was a very faithful daughter of Zeus. Why does that matter? Well, for one thing, is that you know there's merit. There is some merit nowadays to the kind of criticism of patriarchy and all of that, but at the same time, like anything, it brought positive things as well as negative things. And it doesn't do any good to just say, well, the opposite of something that I don't like must be good, because the opposites are often worse. So Athena's very much a part of, let's say, the Zeus, the Jupiterian patriarchy, and she's much loved by Zeus. And why does that matter? Well, that means that Zeus then confers upon her all kinds of abilities and powers, and among them, of course, is that she's a goddess of wisdom. And that kind of wisdom, though, it has this quality of the Greek concept of wisdom, which really has two different sides to it that have to be understood. The one is of course, that you're very familiar with, which one calls the nous, N-O-U-S, or that you translate in Liturgy of Hermes as mind. And the nous is the capacity of the mind to connect to a cosmic order. So it isn't just any old thinking, for example. It's the openness of the soul, let's say, to the meaning of the cosmos as an expression of the divine mind. So it's something that Plato and the philosophers all thought that they did. It's certainly something that Athena was representative of in some ways, because she wasn't thinking of it as a patriarchy. She was just thinking of it as the order of things, the order of the cosmos. And so the one side of the kind of wisdom that she represents is nous, or the noetic, the capacity to open the soul to this order. But the other one is a very practical kind of wisdom, and the philosophers even distinguish between theoretical and practical wisdom. Where theoretical, I would note here, the word theory nowadays is one of the things that's really degraded, because theory just means like some kind of hypothesis. Notice that the stem of the word theory is the same one as theology. You only have theoria proper when you open the soul to the divine. So this very first part of wisdom that I'm talking about. That's not theory like I have an idea about something or positing a hypothesis. This opening of the soul is the crucial thing. But with that comes a practical wisdom that once you understand the order of the cosmos, you also understand how all the situations in your life are microcosms of that macrocosm. And so it makes you prudent, it makes you shrewd, it can make you a strategist, it can make you a person that knows how to solve problems. And when you don't have that openness to the cosmos, every problem is like a new problem. But when you open yourself to the very principles that make this world situations, what they are, then you have a leg up, so to speak, on solving the problems. That's what I think Odysseus sort of represents here. He has that particular shrewdness. He was in some of the myths, he's a descendant of Hermes, and like Hermes, who is not Hermes is is very strategic. He sees the big picture. He also knows how to get around things. He's patron of thieves, so he's got the kind of shrewdness, that kind of thing. All of that's also present in Odysseus, and so I think he was beloved both by Hermes and Athena, because he had both of those and he knew how to bring it to bear, and that's why in the Trojan War he was known to be the great strategist in it.
Well, we see Hermes sometimes coming to him in at least in this mini series where he
Yes.
rescues him
Yeah. Yeah.
with information just when he needs it. Uh,
Yes.
um, Hermes is kind of portrayed as a bit of a um, enjoyer of delivering of bad news.
Yes.
He's the messenger, but he likes
Yeah.
his job.
Yeah. That's right.
Well, we see that Athena wants him to go on this terrible journey.
Mm.
And it is terrible. It's terrifying.
Yes.
It is all
Yes.
these horrible things, and she wants it for him.
Yeah.
And that's the strange part because we see that as a big fish in a small pond, while he surrounds himself with people he sees the good in, he
Mm.
only surrounds himself with people who really support his very limited, we'll call it ego, but his
Yeah.
limited sense of self.
Yes.
Um, and of course, we see them all die and get killed in the journey,
Yes.
which is easy to understand from that archetypal point of view. Um, the shedding of limitations and all of that
Yes.
terrible
That's
aspect.
right.
But this idea that he's going to be pushed away from family and
Mm.
into this war,
Yeah.
and then again the war is 10 years, but it takes him another 10 to return home. I
That's
was
right.
reminded of that notion, something that Jean Dubuis said many years ago, that in classical initiation it takes about 20 years to
Mm.
really move from Malkuth to Tifereth.
Wow.
And that's not even well in how could I put that? It's almost a meaningless phrase because
Mm.
we really don't even know what that means at times when things like that are said. And I see that too when we talk about a lot of things in initiation and of course in the classics. But I don't know, maybe there's something there you can go off on.
Yeah. Well, that Athena wants him to go on it is, of course, basically admitting your point that he's too big a fish for the pond that he's in. You know, oftentimes, I guess I don't know if the literary experts would agree with me on this, but a lot of these stories from the ancients have this quality where there's some figure who has, too much grandiosity, ultimately hubris, right? There's a way where even the hubris of Odysseus is a little bit limited because he's in that little island and just being fawned on, which it can't be that satisfying. But the interesting thing is that, hubris can go two ways. You can either just be knocked down by the gods because of your freaking hubris, or the hubris can be saying, you're larger than this, and you have to become larger than this. And even if you look at, say, the great tragedies like Oedipus Rex, we don't have the middle of it was a triduum of some kind. So there's Oedipus Rex, and we have the final one, Oedipus at Colonus. And Oedipus Rex, you have this very grand figure, and then he realizes what happened to him, and then he really punishes himself, tears his eyes out, goes off as a beggar. But in Oedipus at Colonus, he recognizes, and this wasn't my fault. And he's almost treated as a saintly figure at the end who's gone through this suffering. So there are people who will talk about that as, oh, God, the gods are striking him for his hubris. Well, yeah, but they're also testing are you really up to what your hubris is saying you can be? And I
That
think,
that that does appear in the story. It's mentioned that
yes,
his pride is repeatedly looked upon both in the beginning as a good thing,
yeah,
but
yeah,
that it would be a problem. And then in the end, we see
yeah,
Poseidon saying, "I wish to punish you. I don't
yeah,
wish to kill you. I don't
yeah.
wish to destroy. I wish to punish you." And it's because of his pride.
That's right. Yeah. And so the part of the point is, sometimes hubris is just grandiosity and it's really just petty, but sometimes hubris is actually the inner impulse of divinization.
Mhm.
And a lot of it depends on how you relate to it, right? Sometimes great people or who overestimate themselves, it's because in them is a teleology saying, well, that's not who you are, but that's actually who you're meant to be. So get your ass moving. And in other cases, people just they like the grandiosity itself, and they're it's not serious. It's not something that's an indication about who they're meant to be. So I think in the case of Odysseus, it's like Athena was pushing him into the greatness that he actually needed to become, and he needed to undergo a long process to get there.
And just to give some examples of that I'm sure you've run into them too as well, and maybe some of our viewers can recognize in their own lives or the lives of friends. You know, I've written quite a few books. I have had some assistance with getting them published and done, as many know, with the IHS Monograph series. And I'm running into a lot of people who ask, geez, they want to be a writer, they want to write. And they really don't. What they want is what they think of as the writer's lifestyle. And I've known a lot of musicians, and I've known a few
Yeah.
very successful ones. And the thing that almost always brings them down, and I hear the same stories. It's like, Spinal Tap was a documentary. It's like it's the same thing, easy
Right.
drugs, easy access to women,
Yeah.
easy money, come and go. So they want the lifestyle,
Yeah.
and it's very, very short-sighted.
Yeah.
There's no sense of what will come after, or if there is an after. So a lot of that plays out when we look at our heroes today, because our heroes are mostly media celebrities, not even politicians, but celebrities. Um, what we're seeing is the celebration of that kind of grandiosity,
Yes. Yeah.
that kind of
But not necessarily
individ
becoming, yeah, go ahead.
individualism separated from a divinity. Like they're deified. We deify them,
Yes, exactly.
but they're not avatars.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that that's exactly right because it's again, like you're saying, it aims at the lifestyle, not the sort of person that you could be who could actually benefit from that lifestyle,
Mhm.
or who could make something out of himself because of that lifestyle, or that is thinking about, well, if I have that lifestyle, I can contribute so much. So it externalizes it, but it externalizes it without service. It puts
And,
it outside the person, but not in such a way that it's like oriented toward bringing value to the world. It's just this environment one wants to be in.
and that brings us to the next point. What we see, and this is a very common theme in a lot of movies that attempt to deal with classical symbolism, is the island of the Lotus Eaters.
Yes.
I mean, this might be the single most accurate description of contemporary uh, magical and occult circles today. It's just and well, spirituality in general. I mean, we can think of many things, spirituality, and maybe and even psychology to some degree.
Mhm.
Psychotherapy is hugely just a land of lotus eaters,
I think
uh,
so.
in which
Mm.
they end up there.
Yeah.
They indulge themselves. They think that 5 days have gone by when in fact it's 5 years.
Yeah.
They've lost all this time in self-indulgence.
Yes.
Uh, but it also hints to something else, that time in the invisible is different. It's a different time frame.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on this? I mean, that's Lotus Eaters is popular culture. I mean, that's exactly what we're
No,
talking about.
I think that that's true. I think there's if you look at the Lotus Eaters from a more initiatic standpoint, the real question here is that it's actually increasing forgetfulness. Right? So it's really about how you forget who you are. And arguably, the whole metaphysics that's behind Western esotericism is the idea that remembrance is the main thing. And I would say that that was actually true even actually even in early Christianity. It might surprise people to hear that, but you find in some of like for example in the Philokalia, some of the early ascetic texts amongst the early Christians, that the idea of prayer, or what we nowadays call meditation, that the kind of meditation was understood to be the remembrance of God. There's one of the times that the Ten Commandments is given in the Old Testament begins with, "Remember the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Well, that's a metaphor, right? It's the idea that the remembrance of God means I'm taken out of a world of forgetfulness, of sin. At the time that Israel supposedly left Egypt, and I don't think there are many records that confirm that they actually happened then, but that's at that point the god of death was worshipped frequently in Egypt. So so as they're brought out of it, it's like bringing one out of an ethos of death into an ethos of life. So the remembrance of God here is meant to be a remembrance of who we really are, both of what the divine has done for us, but also what our purposes are. And similarly, the old Platonic myth, that we are outside of time, and then we go through the planetary spheres and come into physical
Mhm.
existence and forget again, and then we have to remember. So everything is really about remembrance of our authenticity, remembrance of what our real destiny is, why we came into the world. It reminds me of Napoleon Hill's comment that we live half our lives before we realize it's a do-it-yourself project. And to get to the do-it-yourself, you still have to know who the self is that you're trying to understand that. That's sort of the first half of life sort of goal. And then afterwards, once you realize that, to try to push that second half of life into really doing it. I think the Lotus Eaters is just a great symbol of all the various ways in which we distract ourselves, where we go into a kind of minor consumerist trances. I mean, all these various ways in which people are sort of dissociated and don't work against that dissociation, because the reality is really trying to understand who is the divine, who am I, what is our relationship, and how is it that I activate that divine spark in me in order to be responsive to that destiny.
Well, that's a theme that we see understated in Western esotericism, even though it's at the basis of it. And if we look at that book, Meditations on the Tarot by
Mm,
Talmberg, we see that he mentions the three things are, memory, to remember,
yeah.
wakefulness, and life.
Mm,
Because if you are not alive, you
yeah.
are dead. If
Yeah.
you are not awake, you are asleep. If you are not
Yeah.
remembering, you are
Yeah.
forgetful.
Yeah.
But the very definition of meditation in practice is not terribly complex. And if you have the good fortune to speak to the people who we think of as really being responsible for it, I mean, mostly the Indians and the Tibetans, and I was very fortunate to have very good exposure for a very long time to uh, North Indian meditative practices
Mm,
from the people who were doing it, and also to Tibetan Buddhism, which I talk about, but I don't go into great detail about. The notion of meditation there is, in the end, is remember, to be undistracted. They would say to be relaxed, but what does it mean to be relaxed? It means to be undistracted.
yeah, that's lovely. And that's something that I feel is kind of both the advantage of psychoanalysis and its failure. Because in a way, the attempt to kind of bring what's called the unconscious, for better or worse, I probably would call it the deep mind, which would be more Platonic, but the unconscious, contained in the unconscious is something about, the experience, presumably not only of this life, but any other lives that we've had, and also some kind of remembrance of what that original destiny was. Um, in a way, whenever you're doing psychoanalysis, you're always trying to awaken someone from amnesia. But if all
Mhm.
you focus on is the complexes, the traumas, all of that as awakening from the amnesia, it's as if you've only done part of the task and not necessarily the most important part of the task, because it's not the question of the factual stuff that happened, but what do I do with it as a way of fulfilling a destiny? So, in a way, what counts as depth in even the depth psychologies seems to me somewhat limited, because it only kind of goes down into this life in many cases, not all of them, but most of them, and also that by focusing on sort of the wounds, but not necessarily what did the wounds mean as part of a bigger narrative of what your life project is. That sometimes doesn't happen either.
Well, we've discussed this at times, and it seems to be that the contemporary psychotherapy and even psychosynthesis to some degree, even though it has the transpersonal inherently built into it, there can be a tremendous emphasis on one, transformation. That is, one gets very caught up in the process of transformation, and we could say one gets very caught up in the process of magical practices. What am I doing? What am I invoking? What am I banishing? What am I, all, there's very I-ness. And the
Yes.
I-ness is not I in terms of a transcendental I engaging in these forces. It's very much in terms of how we see then the notion of the professional magus phenomena, whether it be the TikTok witch or whoever else is posting
Right.
their videos of their newest magical creation and implements,
Right.
which is really a violation of the fundamental notion of silence. Just,
Yeah.
some things are very private. Doesn't mean
That's
you can't, doesn't mean you can't help people, but you're really not helping people by saying how great you are.
no, exactly. Exactly.
Eh, And we see in them that notion is that the even contemporary spirituality has a strong focus on, well, we've said it, analysis is good.
Mm.
Perception and an understanding, a kind of realization of the problem is good. But there's a point then where you either have to resolve it, which is something you can do, which we just said people are coming doing, or the other thing is just stop it. Just
Hmm.
forget about it
You have to know. Yeah, you have to
and
know when to.
just move on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because it's sometimes it seems like once you remove amnesia, then there's almost a sometimes there can be a kind of obsession or fetish with, okay, this defines me so much. Well, part of the point of doing this is that it doesn't define you ultimately. That was the point. It's that to realize that you're larger than your traumas, that you're larger than your complexes, that you're larger than these kinds of wounds is hopefully what one can bring about because you still can tell it in the story of a narrative where it has meaning, where it impelled you, where it motivated you, where it moved you in other directions. I'm in no way trying to say that that's always an easy task. I'm not certainly not trying to do that. But I do think there is a, strong tendency, it seems to me in the last 10, 15 years, to then for people, for example, to take a psychiatric diagnosis and say, well, this is who I am. I'm defined as X. Well, that's not really what a psychiatric diagnosis is. A psychiatric diagnosis is a description of certain characteristics that hang together. They're not causal, in other words. It's just a description that you have it. But people will treat it like, well, because I have a broken leg, I have a limp, okay, well, that makes sense. But that doesn't work with psychiatric diagnosis. They'll say, well, because I'm borderline, I'm treating you really badly.
Yes.
That that it doesn't work the same way. It's instead you've got to do something with it. You have to psychologically, you have to do something with the thing. And most of the characteristics that we understand as negative can be actually turned towards positive, but you got to want to do that.
Well, that's the basis of the tantras and of theurgy, and that's what we see really happening in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is having to take his uh, very strong positive characteristics and understand the negative aspect of them too, and then he has to take those negative aspects and turn them back into a positive,
That's right.
and that he is not limited by his injuries, because at any point in time he or his men could simply be uh, whining in a pile of
Yeah.
self-pity,
Yes,
and they don't.
that's right. Yeah. And that is part of why he's so underlined as a great figure because it's the purposefulness of his drive. We've talked about that also in a lot of esotericism nowadays, where it doesn't seem it's very purpose driven. And one of the things that's very characteristic, say, of good new thought material is that the purpose is what defines everything. And he's very good at that. I mean, his purpose is to go home, and he has a lot of reasons not to when it comes right down to it. But he just keeps pushing, and he has his little plateaus at times where he doesn't know what to do and how to do it and things like that. But he keeps pushing. That purposefulness, that drive, is what's so essential. It would make Napoleon Hill very happy to have such a definite purpose that he's going through all kinds of obstacles, going through underworld initiations, going through all kinds of things in order to get there.
Well, let's talk about that. I wanted to skip ahead, but I won't. because between his experiences with the Lotus Eaters and the witch Circes, and later on his experience with Calypso on that island, which are powerful initiatrix figures.
Yeah,
They're really, and we'll use the Hindu term, they're the Shakti of the whole thing. They're the
yeah,
juice,
that's right.
and there's hyper uh, Venusian sexuality there, but it's something even more than that. It's even more. So we see that really strong initiation potential there. Um, but between that, he ends up going to the underworld, ramming, with a ram
That's
under his
right.
arm.
That's right.
He goes down. He meets well, at least one or more of his dead comrades. He meets his mother, who has
Right.
killed herself because she could wait no longer. And he is taken to meet an ancient philosopher.
Yeah.
And this one will then tell him what's going on.
Tiresias, is
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, any comments on that? Any insights to share?
Yeah, what's the importance of the underworld initiation itself? The Nekaiya, as it's called. I know there's a lot of literature on that in the Jungian world about the underworld initiation, but I don't think there's a sense where there in a lot of the Jungian tradition, it's as if depth is like an end in itself, which is not really true to this. It's that you have to undergo this underworld initiation, and there are a lot of symbols of that in the tradition. Holy Saturday, when the Christ, descends into hell. I mean, there are a lot of things. There's a lot of Native American traditions also that are very much underworld types of initiations because you have to kind of enter into the Great Mother and come out in a kind of rebirth. And so that's something that I think is extremely important in our way of thinking about initiation, which sometimes doesn't get much press. Oftentimes, when we think of the tree of life as just kind of moving upwards, we don't really think of the underworld initiation, which is actually arguably the first thing one has to do. One has to go through, unless you are born again, as John's gospel puts it, here you have to be born again through the Great Mother and come back out. I think that that's actually what the key is there. There's a lot of elements to that have to happen. And it's interesting that Circe or Kirke is the one who is the, kind of more of the witch type. She's more kind of Hecate-like in some ways and kind of shows the way underneath so that he can go through that, get the information he needs, and then move forward. But it's not depth for its own sake. You go into the depths so that you can come out and still focus on the purpose, to go back to my earlier point.
I think that's important because, we're told that again, we mentioned this before, that if one would approach the ancient mysteries and what do you wish? I wish to learn why in order to serve. It's fine. You have to serve another purpose. If it's just about you, nobody cares.
Yeah.
And why should they? There's no reason to.
Yeah.
And we see that within the framework of initiation, classical initiation, excuse me, but we also see that in the framework of the story, that the gods care because he cares about the gods.
Hmm.
What is man without the gods? Man is nothing. And
Yeah.
maybe this is a point to kind of discuss what were the gods in ancient Greece and Rome, but
Hmm.
at the same time to look at this underworld initiation is not just an exploration. It has a goal.
Yes.
And attached to this, we'll point out maybe something. The notions of many modern systems are when we think of thought, word, and deed, or body, speech, and mind, they're really stuck in the head. They
Hmm.
don't somatize
Yes.
the energies very well. Even in alchemy, I've mentioned this, a lot of the alchemists I've known, which is very much about concretizing the energy to releasing and fixing and transforming it. A lot of them were quite unconcerned about their physical health.
Wow.
I mean, it's not that they were indifferent to it, but
Mm-hmm.
they weren't exactly healthy, eating healthy,
Yeah.
and quite a few of them smoked.
Hmm.
The thing which many systems say is terrible for the psychic channels for different
Yeah.
reasons. But we see that kind of disconnect. It's all very
Yeah.
up here.
Yeah.
a lot of talk about here.
Yeah.
A lot of
Yes.
it's up here. There's a lot of talk about here,
Yeah.
but there seems to be a great deal of trouble bringing these three together. And of course, we hear that,
Mm.
and I'll steal the line from Vajrayana: enlightenment of the mind is easy, enlightenment of the body is hard.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, yeah. And there are a lot of ways where that underworld initiation in various forms, insofar as I know, the Celtic forms that are also sort of like that, where I'm reminded here of the Vola's and the Ur group's idea that there are really three centers. There's here, there's the heart, and there's the genitals, and they are different loci for that get energized and illuminated in their various ways. And in this many ways, the underworld initiation is kind of a movement down so that you can move up. And then you start up here, there are a lot of problems that happen. I think what often happens, even the word spirituality is a problem that way, isn't it? I mean, it gives the idea that only if something spiritual is as it's important, as if the spiritual is the opposite of the material in some way. It's not so much that, it's also making your body an apt receptacle for the energies and the kinds of energies and the kinds of potentials that the body have maybe are underrated. When you do this work, the body itself takes on new forms of experience and things like that that have to be um, well, fixed, to use the alchemical language. It has to be fixed so that you can even tolerate the higher energies. And I do think that a lot of systems move upward too fast. There isn't enough of an underworld actual component to it, it seems to me.
Well, even when you do various breathing practices that some folks will be familiar with, you
Yeah,
breathe in through your nostrils, but you move the energy down and then you move it
that's
back
right.
up.
That's right.
And the idea is very clear that you're doing this to awaken
Yeah, yeah,
psychic energies and potentialities in the body,
yeah.
in the
That's
physical body. This is not an abstraction,
right.
that these potentials,
Yeah,
powers are within your physical structure,
yeah,
and that you're managing that by way of the breath and the psychic structures, and that once that is brought into line, into some degree, greater, lesser degree, then those energies get freed up and are available for some kind of new experience and use. And
yes.
not necessarily that experience is going to be always pleasant or understood.
No,
And that's
no.
okay.
Yeah, right. But the alignment is really necessary.
Yeah.
I felt that way back, before my esoteric years, that I was very involved in various kind of Catholic mystical traditions, but I often felt that as time went on, that it just skipped over into spirituality in a way, and that didn't serve me. What it did is it kind of forced the sublimation of energies that would have been better in the development of bodily and physical things into the spirit, and in my view, it also again, not to particularly denigrate,
Hmm.
because I very much appreciate Catholic mystical tradition, but there's also a trend, therefore, uh, to misunderstand asceticism. Like asceticism becomes like an end rather than a means, where it's
Hmm.
really a way of sublimating energy for specific purposes. But it's not as if these physical energies don't also have physical purposes that they should be put to.
Well, it's a way of staying focused and not being distracted.
Yes,
And
yes,
this is the goal, and I'm
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
put everything
yes,
in this direction and
yeah,
work on achieving that goal.
yes.
Uh,
Mm.
I always felt when I did some of those practices, no matter what they were, is that it's almost as if I was just like stuck in this part of my head.
Yeah,
It's like it just everything just went really, not even cerebral isn't even the word.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just a
Mhm.
very narrow range of 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 possibility was being expressed.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Now, we see something happening that I thought was very interesting, and that is that, and you had mentioned this, the Cyclops.
Mm.
That was somewhat of a confusing encounter with me. We see
Yeah,
the
I don't know
Cyclops
why.
on the island. The Cyclops is a Titan, one of three.
Hmm.
His older brothers have the better caves.
Hmm.
He has his cave. And of course, the Cyclops has one eye and is blinded, and that's how they're able to escape.
Yeah.
Uh, you had some interesting thoughts on what the Cyclops was about. Maybe you could share them
Yeah.
for
Well,
us.
you mentioned that, you you could treat the one eye as kind of the third eye, but which is one reading of that. But I tend to think that it's different. It's kind of more to the archetypal point here that the Cyclops was a child of Poseidon. Of course, that's what causes all the problems. Is that Odysseus shows some of his grandiosity by telling his name to without kind of thinking through that. Well, Cyclops might have some friends. It's not going to work for you. So he was a child of Poseidon, and I think it was Thusa was maybe the name of the mother, but the mother was pre-Olympian. She was the daughter of the ocean god that was pre-Olympian. So in other words, she has more titanic quality, and Poseidon, of course, is Olympian, and the two of them. So what you have in Cyclops is a combination of, yeah, there's enough, there's some Olympian, life in it, but it's a strongly titanic figure. So I think, and of course, by the large size and all of that, it also gives us this emphasis on the Titanic. And so I think he represents not the third eye, but having only one physical eye, that is someone who
Mhm.
can't see depth, right? And is primitive and has all the primitivity of the Titanic figure. I mean, in a way, you can see the whole Greek cosmogony as the idea that the Titans, which are representing the more purely physiological and animal and primitive characteristics of the human being superseded by the new Olympian solar approach. So the Titanic doesn't go away. It instead becomes limited within a solar context, which is still why you still have to undergo an underground initiation, which is also basically Titanic in its structure, so that you can come out at the other end of the solar. So I think take Polyphemus, the Cyclops, as being more an example of primitive titanic things that they just can't be transformed, that there's certain things that resist the solar transformation that's proper to initiation. And so that's what Odysseus has to cast aside. That, in other words, that part of the story is him coming to grips with his own titanic structure and having a victory over it. Unfortunately, that also served a kind of grandiosity that got him into trouble. But the trouble itself is initiatic, right? Because as we know, especially when it comes to the heroes are always in an initiatic process with at least one divinity who's against them, and the other ones work for him. And Poseidon is the one, of course, is working against him, and that has its own potential symbolic content. For example, when you do overcome the more titanic qualities in your own personality, that doesn't mean that they go away, but they usually take different qualities. If you think of Poseidon as the ocean, as the as the flow of like emotional and instinctual energy in various ways, you can say it's not that you utterly overcome the Titanic. You overcome the more primitive, crude parts of the Titanic, but now you've
Mhm.
got to deal with, more ones that are more susceptible to the Olympian solar life, but are still going to cause you problems in various ways.
Well, and I think that's the problem that we see in initiation is that it's a fine process. In masonry, they use the symbol of the rough ashlar and the smooth ashlar, where you're getting the bumps off.
Yep.
Um, and this is a big one in the different tantras, where they say it's very, very easy to become a kind of a self-conceit about your development or your achievements, in which you believe that
Yeah.
you can act in any, the crazy wisdom yogi manner, without regards to not only what impact that has, but how others may
Yes.
perceive it or
Right.
misunderstand it. That in fact, as you become more and more, we'll say, progressed upon the path of your own becoming, your own awareness, you have a
Yep.
greater responsibility to not make waves
Yes.
in
Uh,
certain ways, because
yes.
people just want to understand what's going on. It's
Right.
too open to misunderstanding.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. And the tendency toward grandiosity and power complexes in this field is extraordinary. I mean, uh, it's, I mean, you know that. You probably know that better than I do. But I mean, we just see that all over the place. The way in which, you know, relatively minor achievements make people somehow think that they're quite superior. And you can tell because they're advertising way too early about their achievements. And,
And giving 20% discounts if you order
yeah,
now.
that's right.
Well, I see part of this too, where he does get the wind. The wind is captured. The wind is given to him in a bag. The wind is prematurely opened just as they're about to reach Ithaca.
Yes, exactly.
His compatriot, who's too curious, curiosity killed the cat, right?
The,
Curiosity
the
just really
Pandora,
destroy
right? Yeah,
Pandora just destroys this, right?
that's right.
But I thought of this in relation to the blasted tower of the tarot. What
Yeah,
we talked about is the premature return, the premature attempt to,
yeah,
and maybe that's what we're talking about to some degree, that notion of I have achieved, I'll come back, I'll show everyone what I've done. But he still has all his crewmates with him, the ones
yeah.
that have survived so far.
And he
So
takes a nap.
he still has that baggage. Yeah, he was asleep.
He was
He
asleep.
wasn't paying attention.
Yeah,
He,
exactly. And I think that's so important. I mean, this process requires so much patience. And if you can think that, well, I'm just about there, you know, and then you fall asleep, then you lose your attentiveness and concentration, which is so central to this. And so all of those figures around him, who of course were fawning figures, and so they were kind of inferior types, and their curiosity overcame them. They don't have self-control. It's obvious that Odysseus did. I mean, you couldn't go through Scylla and Charybdis if you didn't have that type of, hadn't mastered will, properly speaking, which is of course one of the main things you're supposed to do initiatically, is because we have this fantasy, I think, particularly in America, that the will is by nature free, and it's not. Freedom is an achievement. You
hmm
know, just because you have a lack of restrictions doesn't mean you're free. Free really means that the freedom of the will means that your whole self can be put into something and committed to it. Right. So
Well,
freedom is not something that someone not necessarily has, but you have to have patience to develop it and to really see it to the end. And how often that happens where someone goes well onto the path, but then they kind of lose the idea and they kind of forget that you have to do it. As the athletes say, you got to play the full 60 minutes. Right at the end, you sort of lose it, and then they have to go all the way back.
well, you see that in the yogas. The yogas talks very, very early on about the importance of decisiveness.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to be decisive, and that means full commitment,
Yes.
undistracted,
Yep.
undistracted.
Yep.
And meditative absorption is just that. It's not a secret,
Yep.
it's not a mystery. Meditative absorption is full
Yep.
mental and emotional and physical absorption in the
Yep.
topic or subject of meditation.
That, yeah. That level of concentration, of course, is also kind of counteracted in our society with so much distraction that's kind of presumed to be, well, it's understood as entertainment and relaxation, which I don't think it's either one. I think
Yeah.
it's primarily distraction, but it certainly works against capacity to concentrate. Concentration, again, is not something that has to do primarily with the object. That's what we think. Like if something is interesting, then we're concentrated. Well, the
hmm
point is you got to be able to concentrate even if the object is not that interesting. And that's an inner mastery that it's not really fostered, I don't think.
Well, this reminds me of the passage in the Bible where the maidens are told to keep the oil lamps lit, the wicks, that to not to fall asleep because
Exactly.
the coming of the Son of Man can be at any time. So this notion of, and
Yeah.
even in alchemy, you're told don't rush it at the end. The
Yes.
temptation is to rush it. And if you've even done laboratory work, you're right there at the end. You've put all this time in, and you're almost there. And the tendency is to almost want to push it. And they say, well, if that happens, you burn it,
Yep.
and you've
Yep.
ruined everything.
Yep.
Now, you don't exactly start from the exact beginning, just as Odysseus didn't
Still.
start from the exact beginning,
Yeah. Right.
but
Yeah.
he lost all that time and he
Yeah.
had to start over again with that
Yep.
new
Yep.
knowledge. Now, while this is happening, his wife is at home. She has 108 suitors. I thought that was an interesting number. You see that number of Moabites, 108 suitors. And they are saying, your husband is dead. We're going to have him declared dead. He's not coming back.
Yeah.
And they're all trying to, and it's not clear because I think when we look at these things, how old were these people when they went on the journey? How old is Odysseus? I mean, is he 25? Is he 30? Is he gone coming back at 50? It's not clear. I mean, his wife, will say if she was 25 and her son is now 16 or whatever he's supposed to be, and in the story,
Mm.
like 20, so now she'd be 45. This kind of idea that they're after her, unless we're dealing with some kind of earlier god realm in which people are aging differently.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
The numbers don't point to They don't point to a again a historical tale.
No,
The
no,
numbers don't add up historically, but the suitors are all there. They're all trying to get her. They're all eating her out of house and home. The servants play a large role in the story, more so than in many other stories. And the
mhm.
servants are trying to protect her and all of this. Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah. Well, the servants are playing two sides of it, aren't they? And as I was thinking about that, since we talked about it yesterday, I was wondering to what extent these can be used initiatically as symbols of those parts of ourselves that are debating and fighting and squabbling with each other. The servants are that in a way that the suitors are options. Well, you don't have this, so maybe you should do that, and they all kind of represent, you could see them as representing various possibilities that Penelope has. But her fidelity is really striking here. And in a way, I just propose to you that maybe she represents something like the higher self or say the higher destiny or something, because that's where Odysseus in the end is always intent on going, and that's the initiatic point, is that the ego and the higher self become one. I mean, the full-blown adept is someone who, when he says I, really means both the ego and the higher self, because they're attuned enough. But these all represent all of the various possibilities and distractions in various ways that they could go. But what's interesting is that both Odysseus and Penelope were both single-minded and single-hearted in all of this. And so the conjunctio, it had to happen almost. The initiatic fulfillment had to happen. And there was even a testing, that goes on at the end because of the way that Odysseus designed their marriage beds. She had to test him, to be sure that it's really Odysseus. He tested her about things that only she would know and things like this. So you can see this process because the recognition that, we can be deceived in a number of different ways, but that ultimately they come together. That seems to me a very powerful initiatic part of it. But what I like about what you're saying here is that the servants are kind of protecting her, some are, but some aren't. And it's almost like the way in which we have these inner figures. They often come up in our dreams who are simultaneously trying to protect us, but are also causing us problems. Do you know what I mean? Like sometimes we have uh, uh, parts of ourselves that were very helpful to us at one stage of life and protected us. But later on, we still listen to those parts of ourselves when really it's not functional anymore. We've got one of the things that I think full maturity requires, and certainly initiatic maturity requires, is recognizing when things are useful to you and also when they're no longer useful to you. And in some ways, you could even psychologize these figures as a set of metaphors who are, yeah, they're partially protective and partially not. They partially help you, they partially don't. And you have to make a solid decision about them, whether you really want them still as your servants or not.
I've had that discussion several times over the last few weeks with people, particularly involved in the
Uh-huh.
therapeutic professions, and say, that's like really the definition of the neurotic knot. Look, this was useful to you at one time, maybe when you were 4 or 5 or 6 or 12.
Yeah, yeah,
It's not
yeah,
useful to you anymore.
yeah.
And you have a knot of energy that's tied up there that has to be
That's right.
released. Now, once that gets
Yeah.
released, suddenly you're going to be a very different person in some
Yeah,
ways.
yeah, yeah. It's because those figures that are internal, they're separate from the ego. But when you can actually let them go and pull open that energy and own it, then of course you end up to be much more powerful, you yourself. That energy becomes owned rather than just being this kind of figure in your psyche, these little nodes of energy that are kind of doing whatever they do.
Yeah, it's the protective capacity of no
Yes.
is very good, but it can
Mhm.
become a profound and powerful hindrance when you're
Yeah,
an adult.
very true.
If you're a
True.
child, a teenager, young adult, and you're still trying to figure out, well, is this good for me, bad for me? Is this going to help me, not help me? Sometimes no is a good thing to get some space for decisions,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I see with a lot of adults, they've just gotten so used to shutting things down, just being in
Oh, yeah.
habit mode,
Yeah, exactly.
familiarity habit mode that they don't make
Yes.
any decisions to
That's
change.
really true. That's really true. Yeah. There's a fear of making it, more fear of making a decision than sort of courage to make one and just see what happens with it. Fear of a bad decision is one of the most things that most often stops people from making progress. They're self-limiting because they're so more concerned about making a mistake than they are about actually courageously moving forward and correcting it if there is a mistake.
I think that's important because political correctness over the last 15 or 20 years has really, I find, destroyed the capacity of most people under
Mm,
40 to
mm,
engage in productive dialogue and discussion
mm,
because the onus of everything terrible is mine, even
mm.
if it's not.
Well, that's
And,
true.
this idea that, so there's this constant fear of engagement on a personal level because if I'm misunderstood, it's my fault.
Yes.
And you get to say whatever you want to about what my intentions were.
Yes, that's definitely
Yeah,
true. We'll see that often clinically in practice. You see many patients who have this. It is the generations you're talking about. There's a fear of engagement. There's a certain
engagement.
fear of relationship. There's a fear of really putting oneself out there because suddenly one will be rebuffed for something that one didn't understand or didn't mean or didn't know about or something of that kind. So that also, I think, contributes to the dissociative quality here that we're talking about in the society. You might as well just play video games because I'm not going to be rebuffed by that.
Well, there was a movie I recently watched with Nicolas Cage called Dream Scenario, in which he goes from being this really nobody who people start dreaming about, and they're dreaming about him, and he's doing nothing in those dreams, and he becomes an
Mm,
internet sensation as a professor. And
mm,
suddenly the dreams change, and he's doing these terrible things. So
mm.
what happens then is he says, "But it's your dream. I'm not responsible. I'm not doing those things." But he's treated as if he is. So then
Exactly.
the story revolves around this outcast status,
Yeah.
and I think it's kind of a commentary on what we call cancel culture. Is
Yeah.
that it's your responsibility that I feel this way about you.
Yeah, well, that's
Oh,
it. Yeah, and I have no involvement in it. Also, I mean, that's where someone that's one of the unfortunate pieces of language here is that something triggers me as if that was the cause, and I had nothing to do with the effect. You know?
well, this goes into the notion of heroism because you've talked about the hero. We've talked a lot about that in theurgy and personal responsibility and transformation. And it would seem that the hero Odysseus is very suitable for any age, but particular our current period. But at the
Mm,
same time, the initiatic process then is even more so now, what we could call counterculture.
mm. Yeah, yeah. Because the hero always represents one who feels uh, basically a comprehensive responsibility for him or herself and doesn't externalize. That's the language I use for it, where people will often, if there's something wrong with me, I externalize it. It's got to be something out there that's doing it to me. And it's not that there aren't external forces that are doing things to you, but it's how you receive it and again what you do with it. You haven't lost that responsibility around it. So the idea that one gets triggered, it's a terrible externalizing thing. And again, I won't go into a long diatribe on consumerism again on this, but that does affect this because advertising industry particularly plays off this thing. Oh, you've got this external problem, so just buy this product and let this will solve your problem. Very often, what they do is that like the commercials will evoke existential anxieties that couldn't possibly be solved by a product, and yet we'll try to say, but if you buy this product solve that
Yeah.
problem. And so you never have to deal with anything internal. It's always changing your environment, changing the people you're with, changing your products. It's never the idea that you look inward. Exact opposite of the initiatic tradition.
And within games, they refer to that as fear of missing out.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
They don't even say fear of missing out, they just call it FOMO.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
And
Yep.
well, I think this is the interesting question because now we see Odysseus returns home. He returns, he's dropped off. In fact, he doesn't return,
Mhm.
he's dropped off
Yep.
asleep,
Yep.
which I thought was interesting. He's asleep and he's dropped off on the
Yep.
island. The
Yep.
treasure is given. He has treasure, more than he would have made than he
Yep.
would have from his. I thought that was interesting too.
Yep.
He has more treasure with him now than he would have had from his victory at Troy.
Yep. That's
Okay.
right. That's right.
So we have an interesting symbol there.
Yeah.
And he is transformed into an old man, so he's Saturnian now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he is recognized by his sheep herder, his cattle herder.
Yes. Yeah.
He then meets
His
his
dog.
son.
Yeah.
The son eventually recognizes him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it goes forward to reclaiming his house, his
Yes.
castle, his palace, and
Yes.
getting the suitors out and extracting, we don't say revenge, but you said vengeance on them.
Yeah.
So.
those are very different concepts, I think, and they get, especially in, when I gave the presentation here a few weeks ago at your conference, I mentioned this a sort of popular version of hero, which is basically just some dude getting revenge. And there's a lot of film about that kind. I think of revenge and vengeance as two different things, and I have the impression that the ancients thought of them as different too. Revenge is usually when you're just striking out at someone for what they did to you. Vengeance usually is it's like the difference between anger and wrath. When a person has wrath, they're participating in divine anger. When Moses had wrath, it didn't mean he was pissed off. It meant
Hmm.
that there was divine anger that was also being expressed in him and that he had to act on it. Wrath is of a higher order, in other words. It's a participation in a higher order of being than mere anger is. And I would say the same is true with vengeance. When Augustus, Caesar Augustus, fulfilled his obligation from 40 years earlier to build a temple to Mars Ultor, that is Mars the Avenger, he wasn't saying let's have a temple for everybody who's pissed off at somebody. What he was talking about was injustice, that there's on some kind of higher scale of justice, some injustice was done, and that only vengeance, that it's not getting back at someone for what they did, it's putting the order aright, is what vengeance is. You see this particularly in the Shakespeare tragedies, right? Hamlet
Hmm.
has to kill these people in order to set things right because justice demands that that's the only solution to this particular set of problems. That's not revenge, in my view. Revenge is more as a baser reaction against something. Vengeance is of a higher order. It's saying it's that you're participating in some higher order of justice and trying to resolve that problem. That is what's going on here, because as far as the order of things, Odysseus was not dead. He was not established to be dead. They shouldn't have been there for that. And they
Well,
imposed.
we see that theme again in the epics of Gilgamesh, and we see that
Mm,
in the Bhagavad Gita.
mm,
And Arjuna is just like, my kingdom is stolen, my wife is stolen, but it's my
mm.
relatives,
Yep,
and
yep, yep.
I don't really want to kill them. And Krishna is saying, no, you have to go do your duty
Yeah,
and reestablish order, because if you don't, you're not a king.
that's right.
And maybe this is interesting because we have talked about this often. There seems to be a lack of real capacity for dealing with what we would call the negative, the chthonic, the shadow
Mm,
forces,
yeah,
evil, violence of any kind
yes,
within Christianity.
yes.
Um, and I remember having one professor, he's a wonderful professor, he was a priest, and he was a World War II veteran. He had seen some terrible things. And so his understanding, he was an avowed pacifist, and his understanding was that when Jesus uh, turned over the tables of the money changers on the outer end of the temple, on the porch of
Yeah,
the temple, the
yeah.
porch of the temple, he said that probably didn't happen. It was just the animals causing it to get flipped
Oh,
over.
you see.
So there was his need or necessity to have an incredibly passive Jesus.
Yes,
And
exactly. Yeah.
I don't think that's been very beneficial to us.
No, no, and I would subtleize that a little bit to also say I do have a great respect for what I call nonviolent resistance to something, which is not pacifism. It's taking aggressive energy and giving it another form. Whereas pacifism is one that's really just not admitting aggressive energy. But I also think that nonviolent resistance isn't the only way or the adequate way of dealing with some things. And there has to be a way of dealing with aggression. You know, one of the things that I find very frequently when I'm working as a psychoanalyst is that people confuse aggressive energy with actual aggression against somebody. Aggressive energy is part of being a mammal. We can't undo that, whatever our principles are. We can't undo the fact that as mammals, it's no different that, my dog in my backyard he's going to have his hackles up and he's going to be barking like crazy because that's what he's doing. He's protecting what he thinks is his. As a mammal, we do that. And aggressive energy is not a bad thing. It's as usual, it's what you do with the energy that is the issue. And, you know, there are points where some kind of actual force has to be involved for the sake of justice. And that's why I say, nonviolent resistance can be a force like that. It still is aggressive. It has its own form of aggression. It's a different form of aggression. But I think there also sometimes there has to be actual violence that's involved. But then after all, the state is based on violence, isn't it? I mean, to some extent, that
The
there are,
state has legalized violence. It says we're
yeah,
going to do it all and you can't do any. I mean, that's the
yeah, that's right. That's right. And
st
so,
I
to
mean, here's the
understand,
reality. States do
yeah,
one thing well,
yeah,
kill their own people. I mean,
that's
that's
it. You
fun.
have to, go ahead. Yeah.
I think that notion to extend on that is important because we see that particularly in the notion of transforming girl power is always focused around some false notions of violence.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
the heroine who's capable of, 110 pounds is capable of taking on these
right,
230-pound guys.
right.
It's not realistic. It's not real. It doesn't work that way. There may
Mhm,
be exceptions to the rule, but that's the exception, not the rule.
mm, mm,
And on the other hand, we see this notion of, like you said, the hero being a man of vengeance, of revenge, of which Liam Neeson plays quite phenomenally well in so
mm.
many movies. But this notion of I will take revenge rather than vengeance.
Right, so,
There's no setting the order right, really. It's just even John Wick was that. John Wick is those movies. There's no real nobility in any of those characters. They're all assassins and criminals, and and this has to do with a very ego focused thing. This has to do with
yes,
him and how he was treated and his dog was treated,
yeah.
and we turn that into some notion of heroism when it's
Mhm.
really not. Yet we see in reality our young men are less capable now than ever before of even holding a hammer and
Yes,
quite literally of changing a light bulb.
yes.
So the physicality again. Now they're great at the
Yeah.
games.
Mm,
This part, the imaginative fantasy
mm, mhm.
activity violence,
Yeah,
screen time,
yeah,
but real world action
yeah, yeah.
is simply a point of great fear and confusion,
Yes, I think that's true.
anxiety.
Yeah, and that's again where aggressive energy gets confused with aggression. We need to have a lot of aggressive energy. There's no way that we can do anything that counts as a heroic deed without aggressive energy. It doesn't mean that we're aggressing somebody in any negative sense. Sometimes it may, but even there where it's an aggression, presumably it's something that again is associated with divine wrath, with divine justice, something of that sort. That those are the places where it's actually appropriate for aggressive energy to appear. Doesn't mean that every appearance is a good one, but that's one of the places where it happens.
Well, we can make the argument that on the level of the mind, that the act of concentration is an aggressive act
I would agree.
because we are excluding all other things and focusing just on this, which means we must destroy,
Yes,
to use
exactly.
the metaphor or
Yeah,
whatever, the
yeah.
idea, the eradicate,
Mhm.
remove
Yeah,
anything which is distracting us from this. So if I'm sitting in meditation and we'll say visualization and we allow the memory to arise,
yeah,
I don't force it, I just allow it to rise. And I completely absorb myself in that memory of whatever the subject is, that itself is an act of aggression because I'm
yeah.
keeping everything else out. I set boundaries. So we
Yes,
look at the um, Roman god Mars. I remember originally he was the god of the boundaries.
yes, that's right. Yeah.
And we
That,
we and we see, just to clarify, we see in a lot of these systems the wrathful deities in Vajrayana, the wrathful beings, even demonic beings, or the gargoyles. Those are
yeah,
always at the boundaries of the empire,
yeah.
keeping those things out. Or the magic circle. We create the
Yes.
boundaries of the magic circle of fire. We don't make, it's fire, it's to
Mhm.
burn things away. But then let's jump off for that into the notion of he reclaims or reestablishes his kingdom.
Yeah, yeah. And the kingdom of God is taken by force, I seem to remember. There's a sort of aggressive energy that's all involved in making these kind of ultimate moves. And just to backtrack just for a second, you make this point about the god Mars. Compare that to the Greek Ares, who's supposed to be the correlate. Ares is more like the frenzy. He like it's a different part of the archetype. Ares is more like the frenzy that goes on in hand-to-hand combat. Mars is very much a projection of the Roman army. He's strategic. He's tactical. He knows how to take that energy and force it in such a way that he can bring everybody together. That's a different part of the same archetype. That part of the same archetype is different, but both take extraordinary aggressive energy. And I think the work of initiation is also that, because we've got the self-conquest. It's not an accident that we use the metaphor of conquest in the process. So when he goes in there, he goes in to take on a huge crowd of people, but he's so single-minded, he's going to figure out how to do it. He's got Athena. Remember that the sleep that he had when he was brought back, Athena put him there. So it's not the sleep of the stupor of the Lotus Eaters. It's another kind of sleep. It's a sleep of getting him prepared for and doing the divine act that he has to do, which is one of vengeance. And she also helps him to hide the treasure in the cave, so that he can go do this. And then he prepares and he does the tactical and strategic kind of thought, does the shrewdness you'd expect from him. But he also shows a physical prowess and a capacity for aggression and a capacity for having to take blood if that's what he has to do.
We could look at the sleep of the Lotus Eaters as the dream world. He has
Mm,
left the physical world of Ithaca. He is
yes.
in the dream world, the imaginal realm
Yeah.
of the Lotus Eaters. He struggles with this, and now, but this sleep is the deep sleep of the inner wisdom
Yeah,
revelation.
yes. That's right. That's
It just poof. He is in the
yeah,
stillness that reveals to
that's
him
right.
what he must do.
That's right. And yeah, and it's as if that in that sleep he was also given whatever powers he needed in order to take back his home.
It came through. It no
Yeah,
longer stays in the dream.
exactly.
It no longer stays in the unconscious. He's
Exactly.
aware of it and he brings it through in his dream world into the physical world.
Yeah. And not surprisingly, the thing that shows that he's Odysseus is he's able to string the bow, right?
Hmm.
You think of someone who can actually hit the mark, who has the strength, the prowess, all that kind of combination of, a certain type of intelligence that's combined with strategy and tactic and prowess all together. I mean, it's sort of like it represents him as the whole man.
Well, he shoots the arrow through the
Wow.
ring
12
at the
rings.
base of the handle of 12 axes,
Yeah.
and they go straight through. So we have the axe, which, of course, is a spectacular symbol of their double-headed axes. They're not single.
Yeah.
And the 12 is, of course, the number we see reoccurring in terms of our archetypal potentials of
Yes.
the zodiacal potentiality inside of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
So the arrow goes through all of them, meaning he has fulfilled it's like the 12 labors of Hercules have been
Exactly.
fulfilled.
I think that's
The 12
exactly.
stages of initiation have been fulfilled.
Yep. Yep. So once that's done, then he can actually take it back. And then he just has to do this work of Penelope and him convincing each other that that's who they are. Yeah. But that's
But
the, yeah.
when you look at this, what is the well, something I thought about too is the fig tree in the story. Uh, a fig tree takes him to Calypso's island,
Yeah.
and I
That's
know it's a
interesting.
fig. Yeah, whereas a fig, he grabs onto a fig tree, and that's what keeps him afloat. And I
Yeah.
was reminded of the Jesus and the fig tree.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any particular symbolism of the fig tree that might be important? I mean,
That's all
it
I
is
know.
something one eats.
Yeah. Yeah. The tradition of figs, I think, were traditionally associated with Zeus, weren't they? Zeus and Jupiter.
See, I didn't have time to look that up.
I
I was
think
just
so.
wondering. Yeah.
Seems to me that they were. Now, I don't know how that would work, and I'd have to go back to the story and see how that works. But if it does, I mean, it would be a symbol of abundance, right? There's something,
Yes.
right? Some kind of growth of inner abundance makes it possible for him to survive that blow, or something along those lines, so that he can be taken to the island.
Well, kind of, if you wanted to, I don't know what your schedule is, but if you want to wrap it up or continue, what is your thoughts on the initiatic themes and methods that we can extract from this story that are applicable to us today, particularly around your interest and, of course, the Institute's interest in traditionalism, theurgy, and this heroic quest, particularly in the ways you've discussed it, not in these kind of broad, almost superficial ways of the hero, but in these very, very concrete
Hmm.
ways which you have talked about it uh, at the conference.
Yeah, it'll probably be hard to sum all of that up, but just kind of off the top of my head, I'd say a couple of things I do think the battle with Polyphemus, that's very important there, with the Cyclops, that this conquest over the titanic in us, the part of us that's so primitive that it's not going to be helpful for the movement forward is key. And it's also key to recognize that a certain amount of grandiose energy is understandable, but you got to be careful with it. And by giving his name to the Titanic force, he knew who to pray to, Poseidon. On the other hand, that worked to his favor of initiation. Like I said before, the hero always has at least one divinity against him, and then he has other divinities that are supporting him, which really shows that the divine wants him to go through this, which we already knew because Athena tells him that, right? But he has to go through this process, but he's going to be up against divine energies that are also working against him or that feel like they're working against them when really they're all part of that process. Maybe this goes back to this aggressive point that we're making. If you don't have a ton of aggressive energy and you can't pull that aggressive energy up, you're not going to be able to battle against a god. You've got to be able to be like, like Jacob in Bethel, where he battles with the angel of God and doesn't let him go until he gets his blessing from him, right? That's the kind of aggressive energy you have to have. And so capacity to stand up in the face of divine energy that's working not against you, but it is trying you. It is trying to put you through the trials to show that you can do it. That I think is a crucial element of that. And
I,
it's not for the weak of heart to try to go
I'm,
there.
re- I'm reminded of two things as you said this. One is the notion of divine pride, which is used in
Mm,
Vajrayana when you do what
mm,
would be the equivalent of the assumption of the God form. The pride is not of me here; it's the pride of my inner capacity that I'm
mm.
taking on, I'm
Yeah.
expressing. But it's not one which you use to put others down with, but use to lift them up. I
Yes.
am capable of this. You are capable of this. We all have some potential to expand and grow. But I'm also reminded of Yogananda, Swami Yogananda, in which
Mhm.
he would talk about demand it of God,
Yes.
demand it, and of course he's trying to speak to what I call some nice, quaint middle class or wealthy
Right.
Methodists in the 1920s. But this notion of that we have to approach there's the combination of humility
Yeah.
and yet expectation at the same time.
Yeah.
So in the demanding of it, we just have to take full responsibility for whatever it is we're demanding.
Yes. And all of its consequences, which is why people have such a hard time for making a decision nowadays. It's because, as a rule, a more infantile psychology, which most of us have to a large measure, we want the thing and we don't want the consequences that come with it. But if we're going to face God on that, you live with the consequences. If you want it that bad, demand it and live with what comes with it.
And that's very interesting because I've mentioned this before. Within certain schools, there's this profound obsession with the phrase "do what thou wilt" is the whole of the
Yeah.
law.
Yes.
Love is the law. Sometimes they forget that part.
Yes.
And when I was told that in a
Mm,
different school, it
mm,
was told this is the meaning of it. It's this
mm.
simple.
Mm.
Do what you're going to do and take responsibility for it. And that's it. It's no more complex than that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just take
Yeah.
responsibility.
Yes, exactly. And that's wanting what you want without taking responsibility, I think, is part of the disease of the time. That somehow you shouldn't have to suffer any blows for this. But as we know, esoterically, you don't get anything without giving something up. You've got to be willing to say, no, I don't get this because I do want this. And there's a trend that I've seen very often clinically, which I also, of course, partially trace back to consumerism, but it's the idea that somehow you're free when you have a lot of choices. You're not free when you make one of those choices. When you make one of those choices, it feels like you're giving up too much. So that it gives the idea that where you're free is before you actually make a free act.
I had a friend who used to joke about that, and it's so funny. He used to say, when I go in the grocery store, and this is like in the 80s or 90s, he goes, there's like too many choices. I just want the generic brand. And you kind of remember the generic brand was the black and white label. It said
Yeah, that's right.
peas. He goes, that's
No,
all I
that's
want.
right.
I said, that's very Soviet of you. But at the same time, my wife and I were in Wegmans yesterday,
Hmm.
and as you know, they're terribly overpriced.
Mhm.
But for some things, it's nice to go in and get once in a while, and it's like being in a God realm.
Yeah, yeah.
There's so many wonderful things, so many things to choose, so many things to pick. And for me, it's wonderful because I'm not going to get everything there, and I can go in and pick something new and exciting that I haven't tried before or eaten before, and I can leave.
Mm,
But if you've come to expect that every day of your life
yeah.
and that it should be there,
Yes.
this is where we run into the notions of the different realms, the god
Yeah.
realms, the
Yeah.
demigods, the hell realms, and all of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And we see that that is a background theme in this story because we're talking about the gods, the titans, the Olympians. There's this background of a metaphysic there, and
Mhm.
also the four ages, or the four cycles,
Right.
and of which we've talked a lot about the Kali Yuga,
Yeah.
or the age of iron, the age of lead,
Yeah.
the age of, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see that having any relevance to the story of Odysseus?
Yeah. Well, if nothing else, this is always it's initiation, but I often will use a language like initiatic maturity. To be initiated is to become mature as a human being. And it doesn't work to get a bunch of initiations, but never mature as a human being, for example. And I'm sure you run into that where, someone can give you a list of the 20 initiates, actual formal initiations they've had, and they're still infantile in their tendencies. Oftentimes people will take spirituality that way anyway, right? It's like they want to kind of circumvent the actual work of becoming a kind of fully developed human being from a rational standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, from various standpoints that make for a full human being. But one of the things that's very clear from the Odyssey is that Odysseus was being tested in all of his mettle, to use his piety was tested, his intelligence was tested, his practical abilities, his strategical abilities, those were all tested, his physical abilities. So there's something in this to try to become a fully human being, to become a fully alive human being is part of the initiatic goal here. And when you were saying, for example, here you got an alchemist and they're smoking away, and not there's the contradiction there. It's like the body's not taken seriously; it is just the body, but it's not itself got, for example, potentialities and powers that are part of what your path is. In a way, Odysseus having a definite purpose meant that everything that he did, every part of him could be developed with reference to that purpose. Of course, our bodies, our souls, our minds have all kinds of potentials that we don't use, but the point is that they all become used when we're definite and definitive about the decision towards some kind of purpose.
We could call that purpose his overriding motive, but really it's his the lens of his subconscious. That is his subconscious synthesis. Everything is synthesized or organized for the
That's right.
achievement of that goal. So
That's right.
we see that in the magical practice. We see that in alchemy. Like you have to have an image, an idea, a clear
Mhm.
idea as to the goal of the
Yeah.
practice. And
Yeah.
I've often found with people that's skipped over. They're doing the work, but they haven't taken the time to formulate
Yes.
quite literally a clear image so that they have an intellectual capacity, they
Yeah.
have the psychic dimension, we'll call it the subconscious psychic dimension, and then they have what we'll call the kind of superconscious potential that will link them
Yeah.
to all these great reservoir of information, knowledge, wisdom, power, all this
Yeah.
other stuff. That's right there waiting to be released. That's a pressure. That doesn't have
That,
to be called upon. It's just going to
yes.
pop right through. But without that clear
Yeah.
image, the how is it described in the one sense? The intermediary domain of intuitive insight cannot
Mm.
be realized.
Yeah.
It's like there's a fourth
Mm.
dimension in there, an intermediary domain in
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
the inner image, which has been clearly defined, again, decisiveness,
Yes.
now can be filled or brought to
Yes.
life by the
Exactly.
pressure behind it,
That's right.
the pneumatic
Yep. Yep.
pressure, the
Yep.
psychic pressure behind it. But
Yeah.
it's not happening. So if the
Yeah.
image isn't clear, the image shatters.
I think that's right. I think that's beautifully put. And as soon as you have a pretty clear idea of purpose or purposes, like a few central purposes, all of your powers begin to develop those ways if you really live it out as being central, and then psychic abilities develop, but not just abstractly psychic abilities. There are these people who want to have psychic abilities, but what the hell's the use of having psychic abilities you don't use for a purpose? But when you have a definite purpose, then they begin to develop in a way that's actually helpful to that purpose, because that's how the subconscious mind works. It's waiting for clarity about what you want, what direction you want to go in life, and then it helps develop it. But if you don't have it, then you sit there wondering, well, how am I supposed to do this when you're not even sure what the this is? And in many cases, just from a psychological standpoint, there's all this anti-anxiety. I don't know if you bumped into this a lot. This anti-anxiety of people's abilities and talents. They have them, but there's no purpose for them. And so they get into a deep anxiety and sometimes a deep depression, and they don't know what's doing it because they keep looking for an external cause. When really it's the lack of it, there being an external cause that's causing it, because you got to choose the cause and move in that direction. And when you do that, you'll find that your anxiety greatly diminishes, as well as your depression, once you realize that actually you can be an agent in your own life.
Well, that's it. If you read the writings of like Swami Rama, these folks, these Northern Himalayan guys, and it's always so look, all your problems are your own making. I mean, yeah, there's external stuff, but realistically, your anxieties are because you anxiety is a result of indecisiveness.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
And
and you,
indecisiveness is a result of fear. You
yeah,
are fear
yeah,
of loss, fear
yeah,
of not making the right decision. Therefore, I will lose. What will I lose? I will lose time. I will lose money. I will lose standing in the community. I will lose love. I
yeah,
will lose. What is it? And when all of those things are external, so when you make a decision to do something, and one of the things I find that's fascinating is the unwillingness to accept the notion of compound interest. That your decision to get up and make your bed in the morning is really important.
emulates. Yep, it does. Yep,
Your decision to do your laundry and fold it and put it away is really important. And
yep.
I've shared with you extensively emails that I get from mostly young men, but also
Mhm,
women
mhm.
about their problems in life,
Yep,
many of them which they claim are from demonic influences
right.
or unwanted spiritual influences. And that may very well be true. We're not going to rule that out. We're certainly
Sure.
not. But there's a chicken or the egg question here
Mhm.
because they all have a lot of the same external characteristics. And one of them is they're self-absorbed
Yep,
in their problems. They're
yep,
self-obsessed in this problem cycle solution thing.
yep.
Everything is what can I do to get rid of the external stuff? What will you do for me to get rid of my
Yes,
external problems?
yes,
Not even what can I do? What will you do
yep,
for me?
yes, exactly. Yeah,
And the contemporary cult circles really are encouraging this kind of infantile
I think so too.
approach.
I think so.
They can't get beyond the lotus eater stage. They're.
Well, I think that's right, and where I see that also, and again, I see this clinically as well, is that there's sometimes I'll say to a patient, when you're in that much doubt about what to do, just do anything. Because because oftentimes this fear of doing something wrong, and we've already talked about some of the factors that go into that, are so they so kind of paralyze someone that they almost don't know that they could be agents anymore. And it's much worse if you make no decision than if you make a bad decision, because a bad decision can be corrected.
Well, we just say that do something because then there's some data points to discuss. There's some points for reorientation, but if you just sit there doing the same nothing,
Yes, yes, or and especially with this fear of mistakes. Like I say, and I've often said to people, it doesn't matter if you make a mistake. What matters is if you're not self-correcting.
but
To be
political
used,
correctness says it does matter because you made
right?
the mistake. You're wrong.
Yes.
I had nothing to do with that.
Yeah, exactly,
No,
exactly.
no, no. You did. You did that and you were wrong. You did that on
Right.
purpose.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
geez. I'm done here. I'm out. I'm not going to deal with
Yeah.
this
Well,
anymore.
that's it. That's it.
So
There
what
are a
was
lot of
supposed
forces
to
that
be a very
becomes
liberal and tolerant view is actually a crushing oppressiveness.
it becomes that way, exactly. So a lot of people they get too absorbed in that. That's where you are. You got to be able to make some decision, even if you're not sure that it's a good decision. And you're right. There are all these cultural forces that if you have any sensitivity to them, you're really in trouble. You got to really learn how to thicken your skin and say, look, there's something more important than this. And if you're going to say that that was my mistake when there's something that I didn't know, and that I'm actually must have bad intentions against you because everything is so godforsakenly obvious to you, uh, then I think I'll just go somewhere else. You can't have relationship, for example.
I've often said to people, I said, if I was that powerful, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If I, you know, it's fascinating that the traditional values that are needed for work on the path are clearly counterculture in the moment.
Yes, at the moment,
I
yeah.
think they have been more or less at all times, but it seems even more so now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
if you were
because
to, I was
another
just
eight.
going to say, if you could look at some heroes, how would you suggest to people what should they look for in a heroic archetype, which is a god form,
Yeah, true
which
enough. Yeah.
is a god that what should
Mm.
they look for in a heroic archetype or archetypes to help them on the path?
Well, to me, it's, always I think taking the great heroic stories from the ancient world are, of course, a main topic, because I think most contemporary stories aren't so hot. But, a lot of the great epics, all the great epic poems have, really good sources for meditation and so forth. But really, what you're looking for is a couple of things. I think one of them is how it is that one looks at obstacles as possibilities, as opportunities. I think, when you live in a society where wills are pretty weak, any obstacle looks like, okay, I can't do it. One of the things the heroes always did is they found some way of doing it. And that doesn't mean that they did it themselves, but because they kept being persistent at trying to solve a problem, often the divine just came in and did something, or some other force came in and did it. Persistence is really key in all of that. So I think, looking at obstacles and how you can turn them into opportunities with the recognition that it doesn't all depend on you, but it's one of the key things that Ignatius of Loyola taught is that, God, act as if all things depend on you and know that it never depends only on you, that it depends much more on God than on you,
What
so
Swami Rama and Yogananda said the same thing over and
yes,
over again, and
that's
so
right.
have the many of the
Yeah.
lamas which I've known. That you
Mhm.
you it's that's fascinating because it's a little engine that could story. I think I can, but then we have that notion of um, persistence, uh, dedication, and here in the story that we're talking about, Odysseus, the gods will not do for you what you must do for yourself.
Yes,
And,
absolutely right.
and yet God helps God.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's nicely put that, the gods won't do for you what you have to do for yourself, but they will be there, providing that you do what you have to do for yourself. Yeah.
That was part of the story too, is people, and I see this a lot in contemporary society, uh, mostly among the audience we've talked about, where the gods look at the pride and the disdain, when of Odysseus when he is not recognizing what they have done for him, only
Yeah,
complaining about what they haven't.
exactly. Exactly.
And
Yeah.
that's it's like people who I see today who they look at all the problems in the world, in their life, in society. And yes, that is the situation you are in. Now, what is it that we can do?
Yeah.
What plan to address some part or all of this?
Yeah.
How are you going to
Yeah.
do this? And that's where that's where I find things collapsing,
Yes.
is
Yeah.
there's the unwillingness to make an effort.
Hmm.
And that kind of feeds back into what we've seen about a lot of the fatalism, the nihilism, the pessimism, even in contemporary spirituality, where a kind of environmental or political or economic apocalypse themes are incredibly popular because
Yes.
it's a way of removing any responsibility from me from
Yes.
having to do anything.
Yeah. 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 It's there's a what in the classical Freudian tradition would be called omnipotence fantasies, that, either I'm in total control or I have no control. And anytime you've got those kind of sharp opposites, it is right. The middle way is always telling you what it's actually like. And so to the point is to be an agent in the parts of your life where you can actually be an agent. And that, people are dealt a bad hand. That's obvious. I mean, there's a lot in our society that does deal us a bad hand. That's straightforward. So you can complain about it, but it's not going to make your life better. What makes your life better is to say, where is my agency possible? What can I do about it? And that's very much what the heroic stories are about, is learning how to be an agent, how to take full responsibility for anything that you do, to understand that any choice has its consequences. So when I make a choice for it, the consequences come with it. And that means that oftentimes it means that I pay a price of some kind. Sometimes that price may seem too high. Oftentimes, once you've made the decision and realize how valuable it is, yeah, it wasn't really that big a choice. It only looked like it at the other side of it. But that's all part of learning how to be a really free human being, a fully mature human being who knows how to exercise the will.
I think what comes to mind is a saying a Russian friend of mine used to say back in the day. His family left the Soviet Union, Odessa, in fact, at the time, and the father had hid out in the caves during the war, during
Mm,
the Second World War,
mm,
and I remember him saying, "I'm not so rich that I can afford to buy cheap."
mm. Yeah,
You buy something that you think is a discount or a cut rate, or you're getting a super bargain, and often you have to then
yeah,
replace it many times. And I
yeah.
think that's particularly true in
Mm,
esoteric teachings too.
that's right. Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
I want to get something for nothing.
Yeah.
Something's owed me.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm going to do how many YouTube podcasts and suck up
Yes.
all this information, but
Mm,
what can I do with it at the end? Well, it's kind of like a psychic indigestion.
yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And then, in the age of information, it's been a disaster that way anyway, quite independently of esotericism, because we don't have any criterion to judge whether something's of value or not. We don't have the old traditions where things were handed down by initiates, oral traditions primarily, and things like that. It becomes much worse, I think, in esoteric traditions. And of course, it becomes a commodity, more commodity, which isn't necessarily helping either. But none of those things are conducive to this agency, to that
Mm.
genuine sense of true will that you were talking about earlier. Where
And then it goes back to the company you keep, which is again the story of Odysseus in many ways. The company he keeps
yep,
reinforces, yes, many good qualities, some not so good
but
qualities,
not so good ones too.
but then he takes on the company of the gods.
Yes,
They
exactly.
take on a more and more
Yeah,
dominant
yeah,
relationship with
that's
him.
right. And I would say that he can't take on that relationship unless he gets rid of them. I see this again all the
Yeah.
time as a clinician, is that of patients who won't get certain energies out of their lives that they know full well are going to exclude better energies. And when they can make the renunciation, they can actually make the move.
Well, I think that's just a wonderful point to end on. I want to thank you very much for the last
Yeah,
2 hours of
yeah,
your time, and I hope
yeah.
that those of you who will be listening to this in the future will take it to heart and take advantage of the coursework that we've created specifically to make us more potent agents in our own lives, more potent and realized agents in our own lives. Not just forces, but forces with intuitive and very genuine wise, that nous, the awakening of nous, and that, well, that's why we've done it. So
Thank
with that, I want to say thank you very much.
you
And
for the opportunity.
thank you.